A man lies dead on an Australian beach, dressed immaculately in a suit with every label cut away. No fingerprints match, no one claims him. In his pocket, 2 words in a foreign script, Tamam Shud. It is finished. But finished what? When Detective O'Connell finds the code hidden in a book of Persian poetry, he discovers this isn't just a death, it's the final entry in a kill list that reaches into the highest levels of power. The first light of December 1st, 1948, bled across the horizon at Somerton Park beach, turning the calm waters of Gulf St. Vincent from inky black to a sheet of hammered silver. The air was still cool, carrying the clean, salty scent of the tide. It was a morning like any other, quiet and placid, until a man walking his terrier along the shoreline came to a sudden halt. The dog whined, straining at its leash. The man raised a hand, shielding his eyes against the new sun, and pointed. There, propped against the stone seawall below the esplanade, was a figure. A man, seemingly asleep, his head resting against the concrete, legs extended before him. He was impeccably dressed in a double-breasted brown suit, a crisp white shirt, and a red and blue patterned tie, neatly knotted. From a distance, he could have been a businessman who had stayed out all night, waiting to watch the sunrise. But there was a stillness about him that was absolute, an unnatural rigidity that defied the gentle sea breeze ruffling the grass atop the wall. His polished brown shoes, resting on the sand, were impossibly clean, as if he had been placed there by a careful hand. Everything about the scene was neat, orderly, and profoundly wrong. He was a piece of perfect, silent machinery set down in the midst of the gentle, shifting chaos of the shoreline, and his presence violated every rule of a simple morning by the sea. The morgue was a place of cold, hard facts. It smelled of antiseptic and refrigeration, a sterile silence broken only by the low, constant hum of the coolers. Detective Sergeant Arthur Art O'Connell stood over the stainless steel table, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of weary professionalism. He was a man in his 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a deep-seated pride in his methodical process. A case, to Art O'Connell, was a disordered system that he, through logic and procedure, would return to a state of order. The body on the table was a direct affront to that belief. "No signs of struggle," the coroner said, his voice echoing slightly in the tiled room. "No wounds, no bruises of any significance. Lividity suggests he died where he was found, sometime after 2 a.m. His last meal was a pasty, 3 or 4 hours before that." O'Connell nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the dead man's face. It was a strong face, handsome in a rugged way, with greying hair at the temples. A man in his prime. "Oh, cause of death?" The coroner sighed, tapping a pen against his clipboard. "That's the question, isn't it? There are signs of acute congestion. Lungs, stomach. Spleen is enlarged, about 3 times the normal size. Liver is engorged with blood. It points towards poison, something that doesn't leave an easy trace, but toxicology will take time." O'Connell leaned closer, his attention drawn to the man's clothing, which now lay neatly folded on an adjacent table. He picked up the suit coat. It was well made, the fabric of high quality. American tailoring, the coroner had suggested. But where a tailor's label should have been, there was nothing but a few loose threads. He checked the trousers, the shirt, every single tag, every maker's mark had been meticulously snipped away. He ran a finger over the smooth, brandless fabric of the tie. This wasn't a crime of passion or a simple robbery. This was a deliberate erasure. Every potential clue, every thread that could connect this man to a place, a tailor, a life, had been systematically and purposefully removed. The absence of evidence was the only evidence they had. It was a perfectly constructed void, a puzzle with all the edge pieces missing. It was an insult. By nightfall, the void had only grown larger. O'Connell stood in his office, an island of beleaguered order against the encroaching chaos of the case. A glass of whiskey sat untouched on the corner of his desk. Before him, A large chalkboard hung on the wall, its surface stark white under the glare of the overhead lamp. He'd divided it into 2 columns with a sharp smack of the chalk. Known. Unknown. The known column was pitifully short. Man, 40-45 years old, excellent physical condition. Found Somerton Beach, deck 1, died approx. 2 a.m., clothing labels removed, possibly poisoned. The unknown column was a cascade of furious chalk strokes, a waterfall of questions. Who is he? Where did he come from? Why were the labels removed? Suicide or murder? If murder, why leave the body in public? Why Somerton Beach? He was a man accustomed to filling in blanks, and the sheer glaring emptiness of the board was a personal affront. A young constable knocked softly before entering, a small cardboard box in his hands. His personal effects, sir. Found a few more things. O'Connell turned, his expression grim. Anything useful? Hard to say, sir. The constable placed the items on the desk. An unused ticket for the 10:50 a.m. bus from the city to Glenelg. A pack of juicy fruit chewing gum, half full. A book of matches from a local hotel. All of it was common, disposable, untraceable. Dead ends. There was one more thing, sir, the constable added. In the fob pocket of the trousers. The boys at the station missed it at first. It's tiny. He handed over a small evidence envelope. O'Connell tipped it over, and a tightly rolled scrap of paper, no bigger than his thumbnail, fell onto his palm. It was thick, high-quality paper, torn unevenly from a larger page. Using his fingernails, he carefully unrolled it. Printed on the surface in an elegant serif font were 2 words, Tamam Shud. O'Connell stared at them. It wasn't a name. It wasn't a number. It wasn't a clue he understood. It was language, foreign and strange. It felt less like evidence and more like a line from a play he hadn't seen. It was another piece that didn't fit, another detail designed to frustrate and confuse. The next day, O'Connell found himself standing on the thick carpet of Police Commissioner Davies's office. The room was a fortress of establishment power, all dark wood, leather-bound books, and oil portraits of stern, mustachioed men who had held the post before. Davies, a man who was more politician than policeman, steepled his fingers and looked at O'Connell over the top of them. "The press is having a field day, Art," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "The mystery man, they're calling him. It's on every front page. And we have nothing. No identity, no witnesses, no motive. We have a potential cause of death, and we have a new line of inquiry," O'Connell stated, his tone clipped. "It will take time." "Time is a luxury the public and the press are not affording us," Davies countered. "We need to be seen exploring every possible avenue, which is why I've taken the liberty of reaching out to the university." O'Connell's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Sir?" "There's a man in the mathematics department. A Dr. Vance. Bit of an eccentric, apparently. But he consulted for the military during the war. Cryptography, ciphers, that sort of thing. I've sent him a copy of those words we found. Tamam Shud. He's agreed to consult." A cold knot of anger tightened in O'Connell's stomach. He kept his voice level, respectful, but the effort was immense. "Commissioner, with all due respect, this is a police matter. The answer will be found with forensic science and proper detective work, not by reading tea leaves with some academic." Davies gave him a thin, patronizing smile. "Think of it as another tool in your kit, Sergeant. We need a fresh perspective. You will give Dr. Vance your full cooperation. That's an order." O'Connell stood there for a moment, the words hanging in the air. His world of procedure, of facts, of evidence, was being invaded. He was being told to trust the intuitive leaps of an outsider over the scientific rigor of his own profession. He saw his carefully ordered investigation beginning to fray at the edges, pulled apart by political pressure and now by what felt like little more than academic fancy. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He turned and walked out, the gallery of stern, dead commissioners watching him go. O'Connell's journey to the University of Adelaide felt like a pilgrimage of penance. Every corner he turned was a reminder of his own investigation's failure, a failure that had led him here, to the quiet, dusty halls of academia, seeking help he did not want. The special collections room was nothing like his own orderly office. Where he had neat files and bare walls, this room was an explosion of controlled chaos. Books overflowed from shelves, stacked in precarious towers on desks and chairs. And they weren't just books on mathematics and ciphers. O'Connell's eye caught leather-bound tomes with titles on alchemy, illustrated guides to mythological beasts, and complex diagrams of esoteric symbols. It was the office of a man who saw the world not as a set of rules, but as a library of secrets. Dr. Elias Vance emerged from behind a mountain of manuscripts. He was a man of about 40, with a shock of unruly hair, spectacles perched on the end of his nose, and an electric, boundless energy that seemed barely contained by his tweed jacket. There was a manic gleam in his eye, the look of a man perpetually on the brink of a discovery. "Detective Sergeant O'Connell," Vance said, his voice a rapid-fire staccato. "You have it." O'Connell held out the small evidence bag containing the Tamam Shud scrap. He extended his other hand for a handshake, a gesture of professional courtesy, but Vance ignored it completely. The doctor snatched the evidence bag from his fingers like a starved man grabbing a piece of bread. He held the tiny scrap of paper up to the light of a desk lamp, his excitement a palpable force in the room. "Incredible," Vance breathed, turning the paper over and over. "It's a code of some kind, we assume," O'Connell said, his voice flat and impatient. "We need it broken." Vance laughed, a short, sharp bark that made O'Connell flinch. "A code? Detective, this is so much more than a code. A code is a mechanism for hiding information. This is a statement of intent, a philosophical signature. This isn't a puzzle to be solved, it's a message to be understood." O'Connell stared at him, his expression hardening into a mask of hostile disbelief. He saw a man lost in fanciful interpretation, a performer delighting in his own intellectual theatre. He saw a waste of his time. To O'Connell, the pragmatist, it was a piece of paper with letters on it that needed to be analysed, not a symbol that needed to be interpreted. The chasm between their two worlds had just opened at his feet, and it was vast and deep. The days that followed only deepened O'Connell's frustration. His world, the world of evidence and procedure, was crumbling. The Adelaide police station became a clearinghouse for dead ends. "The prints are a negative, sir," a young constable reported, standing stiffly before O'Connell's desk. "We've checked them against every record in Australia. Military, civil, criminal. The man doesn't exist." The nationwide appeal for information was an even greater disaster. The phones rang incessantly, a chorus of misguided civic duty and morbid curiosity. Another officer handed O'Connell a stack of memos. "Dozens of calls, sir. Most of them are cranks seeing ghosts. We've followed up on the few that sounded plausible. Nothing." O'Connell himself took a call from a frantic woman in a nearby suburb. Her voice choked with tears as she described her husband who had gone missing 2 days prior. O'Connell listened patiently, his pen poised over a notepad. "And his height, ma'am?" he asked. The woman gave a figure nearly a foot shorter than the man in his morgue. "Thank you for your time, ma'am," he said, his voice gentle, before hanging up the receiver with a heavy, final click. He leaned back in his chair, the frustration boiling in his veins. His entire system, the rational, scientific process of elimination and data collection, was utterly impotent. It was like trying to catch smoke in a net. There was simply nothing to hold on to. Defeated, he found himself back at the university that night, the scent of old paper and dust, a welcome change from the sterile despair of his own office. He found Vance in his natural habitat, a king reigning over a kingdom of books. The manic energy was gone, replaced by a focused intellectual fire. "I have it," Vance said, not as a greeting, but as a continuation of a conversation that had been going on in his own head for days. He gestured for O'Connell to come closer. In the center of his desk, an old, beautifully illustrated book was open. It took me some time. I was looking in ciphers, in historical records. I should have started with the poets. He pointed a slender finger at the open page. It's the final phrase from a very specific English translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. O'Connell leaned in, reading the Persian verse and its English counterpart. And what does it mean? Vance's eyes lit up. He began to pace, reading passages aloud from memory. The moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on. Nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it. It's a work of profound fatalism, detective. A call to live life to its fullest, to drink the wine, to love the beloved, because the universe is indifferent and death is a final, unknowable end. Tamam Shud literally means it is ended, or it is finished. Vance stopped pacing and looked directly at O'Connell. My theory, our man wasn't just a suicide. He was a philosopher, a nihilist who planned his own exit as a final poetic act. This wasn't a cry for help. It was his closing statement. O'Connell listened, his skepticism a physical presence in the room. He saw the logic, but it was the logic of literature, not forensics. It's a book, Vance, he retorted, his voice laced with impatience. It's a book, not a confession. Unless it can give me a name or a fingerprint, it's just a story. He was driving away from the university, the scent of Vance's dusty book still in his nostrils, when the radio crackled to life. It was a patrolman, a local man, a chemist had just called in. He'd found a book in the back of his unlocked car, which had been parked near Somerton Beach on the night of November 30th. He'd thought nothing of it until he read about the Tamam Shud clue in the papers. O'Connell's heart hammered against his ribs. He turned the car around, his foot heavy on the accelerator. He arrived to find two uniformed officers speaking with the chemist beside his car. The book was already in an evidence bag, sitting on the hood. O'Connell's eyes locked onto it. It was a slim volume, its cover worn. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. With a gloved hand, O'Connell took the book. He opened it carefully. The page with the final verse, the page that should have contained the words Tamam Shud, had been torn out. He flipped to the back cover, and there it was, written faintly in pencil, as if by a hesitant hand, were 5 lines of capital letters, their meaning inscrutable. A code. And beneath the code, something that required no interpretation at all. A local 7-digit phone number. O'Connell stared at it, the streetlights reflecting in his wide eyes. The world seemed to fall silent around him. Vance's fantastical theory, his dive into poetry and philosophy, his reading of tea leaves, it had just produced the first solid, tangible, investigable lead of the entire case. Vance was right, and in that moment, the first crack appeared in the foundation of Detective Sergeant O'Connell's orderly, rational world. The phone number was a key, a solid piece of evidence in a case made of smoke and shadows. For the first time since this whole affair began, Detective O'Connell felt the familiar, firm ground of procedure beneath his feet. The number was registered to a modest but immaculately kept house in a quiet suburban street, the kind of place where nothing interesting was ever supposed to happen. He and Vance stood on the porch, the scent of freshly cut grass hanging in the air. O'Connell was the image of official inquiry. Vance hovered behind him, an awkward shadow of academic curiosity, his eyes taking in every detail. The door was answered by a woman in her 30s, dressed in a crisp nurse's uniform. She had intelligent, watchful eyes and a posture of guarded composure. This was Eleanor Marshall, though she told them to call her Eliza. O'Connell was direct. "We're here investigating a death, ma'am. Your phone number was found among the deceased's effects." Eliza's composure fractured instantly. It was a subtle thing, a flicker in her eyes, a tightening of her jaw, but it was there. "My number? There must be some mistake. I don't know anyone who has died." Her denial was a wall, erected too quickly. O'Connell pressed on, his voice even. "Perhaps you'd recognize him." He produced a small box from his coat. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a plaster cast of the dead man's face and shoulders, a ghostly white effigy. He held it out to her. Eliza recoiled as if struck. Her gaze darted to the plaster face for a fraction of a second before she turned away, her hand flying to her throat. "No," she whispered, her voice thin. "I've never seen that man in my life." Her denial was total, absolute, and utterly unconvincing. They left moments later, the front door clicking shut behind them. O'Connell was silent for a moment as they walked back to the car, processing the lie. "She recognized him," he said, stating a simple fact. "Oh yes," Vance agreed, his expression thoughtful. "But it's more complex than that, Detective. That wasn't the face of a liar." He paused, looking back at the house. "That was the face of someone who is terrified of a truth she knows." O'Connell saw a witness who was obstructing justice. Vance saw a human puzzle, a person trapped between knowledge and fear, and understood that simple, factual questions would never be enough to unlock it. That night, the code was the only thing that mattered. Back in the chaotic sanctuary of his library, Vance had the cryptic letters projected onto a large screen, where they hung in the darkness like a string of alien symbols. O'Connell stood with his arms crossed, his patience wearing thin. "Why is it so difficult?" he demanded. "It's letters. There must be a system, a pattern." "Precisely, and that's the problem," Vance explained, pacing excitedly before the screen. "It defies every standard system. I've run frequency analysis for every common language. Nothing. The letter distribution is wrong. It's not a substitution cipher, not a transposition cipher. The patterns are deliberately random, which suggests a one-time pad, but there's no corresponding key." He pointed to a few letters that seemed out of place. "And these are the real problem. They don't fit. They feel like markers, not part of the message itself." Vance stopped pacing and turned to O'Connell, his eyes wide with a dawning, fantastic theory. "I don't think this is a code meant for an army or a government. I think this is a personal language, almost a form of automatic writing, where the key isn't mathematical but intuitive, symbolic, known only to the sender and the intended recipient." O'Connell stared at him, aghast. "Automatic writing? Personal language? Vance, that's fantasy. We're dealing with a murder, not a seance. It's a code. It has a key. We just need to find it." The wall between them was back, higher and stronger than before. O'Connell wanted a logical solution, a key that could be found and tested. Vance was suggesting the key was a feeling, a belief, something that existed in the realm of superstition. Frustrated and convinced he was wasting his time, O'Connell returned to the cold, hard certainty of his own methods the next day. If Vance wanted to chase ghosts and symbols, fine. He would chase facts. He found himself in the city's public records office, a drab, fluorescent-lit world of filing cabinets and the quiet rustle of paper. The air smelled of aging pulp and dust. This was his territory. He started with Eliza Marshall. A few hours of digging confirmed her story. She was a nurse. More importantly, she had worked at a military convalescent hospital near Adelaide during the final years of the war. That was a tangible link, a solid fact. He requested the hospital's records, and soon he was sitting before a thick ledger containing the patient and staff manifests from 1944 to 1945. Page by page, he began the laborious, mind-numbing process of cross-referencing names and dates, his finger tracing each line. This was the work. It was tedious, it was methodical, and it was grounded in a reality he could trust. This was his ritual, his way of imposing logical, bureaucratic order on a case that was rapidly spiraling into the irrational. That night, two different kinds of magic were at work. In the university library, surrounded by diagrams of celestial bodies and alchemical symbols, Vance had an epiphany. He stopped looking at the code as a string of letters to be deciphered and started looking at it as a map. He took a diagram of a Rosicrucian mystical chart and overlaid it on the projected letters. He treated the anomalous letters, the ones that didn't fit, as symbolic markers, like stars in a constellation. Suddenly, the random string of characters locked into a new kind of order. It wasn't a word-for-word translation. It was a conceptual one. A single, terrifying phrase snapped into focus on the screen, clear as a church bell. Sanctuary breached. At that exact same moment, in his starkly lit office, O'Connell A.S. finger, guided by a wooden ruler, slid down the last page of the patient manifest. His eyes, weary from hours of reading, snagged on a name. It was an unremarkable name, but next to it was a small typed notation from a military file. The notation was an acronym for a small, highly secretive military intelligence unit, a unit that technically didn't exist. This was it. This was the man. O'Connell's heart leaped. He had him. He reached for his telephone, his mind racing as he prepared to tell Vance that his tedious, grounded police work had finally yielded a result. But before his fingers could dial, the phone on his desk rang, its shrill cry cutting through the silence. He snatched it up. "O'Connell! I have it!" Vance's voice crackled on the line, taut with a mixture of terror and triumph. "It's a warning! Sanctuary breached." O'Connell felt a chill crawl up his spine. He stared at the name in the ledger. "I have him," he said, his own voice barely a whisper. "I have his name." The two disparate lines of inquiry, the intuitive, symbolic leap and the tireless, evidence-based grind had converged on a single, violent point. They were no longer investigating the strange death of a nameless man. They had just knocked on the door of a secret world, and they now knew, with absolute certainty, that someone was on the other side. They didn't knock this time. When Eliza Marshall opened her door, O'Connell and Vance were already on the porch, their faces grim. O'Connell held up the name he had found in the records, a name that was not an accusation, but a statement of fact. Vance stood beside him and softly spoke the words he had pulled from the ether of the code. Sanctuary breached. The effect on Eliza was immediate and devastating. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a pallid, waxy sheen. Her carefully constructed composure didn't just crack, it disintegrated. She staggered back from the door, one hand on the wall for support, and collapsed into a kitchen chair as if her bones had turned to water. The fight was gone, replaced by a wave of crushing despair. "You knew him," O'Connell said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "His name was Alf," she whispered, the name a ghost on her lips. He was a patient at the hospital after the war. He was quiet, gentle. He used to read poetry." Her gaze drifted to a small bookshelf in the corner. "I gave him the book, the Rubaiyat. He loved it. He said it was the only thing that made any sense." Vance stepped forward, his voice softer than O'Connell had ever heard it. "What was he afraid of, Eliza?" Her breath hitched in a sob. "Everything, everyone. He was involved in secret work during the war, things he could never talk about. But after, he said they were cleaning house, purging their history. He said they were silencing loose ends, erasing anyone who knew what they'd done." She looked from Vance to O'Connell, her eyes pleading. "I don't know any details. I didn't want to. I just know he was terrified. He said the book was important, that it was the only key he had left." The rational facts of O'Connell's case the name. The military unit were now inextricably bound to this woman's raw, emotional terror. The human cost of the conspiracy was no longer an abstract idea. It was sitting at a kitchen table, weeping for a dead man. The conversation with Eliza had changed the temperature of the air. The world felt colder, the shadows deeper. As O'Connell drove away that evening, his mind replaying her terrified words, he noticed it in his rearview mirror. A black sedan, its headlights two impassive eyes in the growing dusk. It kept a steady distance, making no move to overtake him. It was professional, patient. It stayed with him for 6 blocks, a silent, menacing companion, before turning off abruptly and disappearing into a side street. It was a message. "We see you." Paranoia began to prickle at the back of his neck. Later that night, as he was driving home along a quiet, tree-lined road, it happened. He tapped the brake pedal to slow for a corner, and his foot went soft, sinking towards the floor with an unnerving lack of resistance. He pumped it desperately, a jolt of pure adrenaline flooding his system. The car swerved, its tires screeching on the asphalt as he fought the wheel, narrowly avoiding a head-on collision with a pair of startled headlights. He wrestled the car to a shuddering halt on the shoulder, his heart hammering against his ribs, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He got out, his legs unsteady beneath him. In the silent darkness, he knelt down and saw the dark, glistening puddle of brake fluid spreading on the pavement. This was no accident. The invisible, almost superstitious fear of a shadowy group had just been made brutally, physically real. The conspiracy was no longer a puzzle to be solved. It was a predator, and it had just shown its teeth. The predator was hunting on 2 fronts. The next morning, Vance walked into his university library office to find a scene of quiet violation. Books had been pulled from the shelves and tossed to the floor, their spines cracked. The room, his sanctuary of chaotic order, had been desecrated. But it wasn't a simple ransacking. Nothing of monetary value was gone. Instead, his research papers on the Somerton Man's code, his weeks of painstaking work, had been taken from their folders and arranged on his desk in a neat, deliberate mocking pattern. It was a message written in the language of intimidation. Shaking, Vance grabbed the phone and called O'Connell. His voice, usually so full of energy and intellectual fire, was now thin and trembling. "They were here, Art, in my office." He described the scene, the symbolic nature of the attack. "This isn't just a cover-up by some former spies," he insisted, his voice rising with a terrified conviction that O'Connell could not dismiss. "This is a society. It's a belief system, with its own sacred truths, and they see us as heretics. They're not just trying to scare us. They're trying to tell us we've committed blasphemy." The summons came the next day. It wasn't an arrest warrant delivered by a uniformed officer, but a polite, hand-delivered invitation on thick, cream-coloured cardstock. Sir Geoffrey Blackwell requested the pleasure of their company for a drink at his club. The club was the beating heart of the Adelaide establishment, a place of hushed tones, dark wood panelling, and the scent of old leather and expensive cigars. It was a world away from the grit of O'Connell's police work and the dusty chaos of Vance's library. Sir Geoffrey Blackwell, a man in his 60s, rose to greet them from a wing-backed chair. He was impeccably tailored, his face a mask of calm, patrician authority. He was a decorated war hero, a titan of industry, and, as Vance knew all too well, a major benefactor to the university. He gestured for them to sit. He didn't need to raise his voice to command the room. "Thank you for coming, gentlemen," he began, his tone disarmingly pleasant. "I thought it best we speak directly." Without preamble, he began to calmly detail their every move for the past week, from their conversations with Eliza Marshall to the discovery of the code, even referencing the unfortunate mechanical trouble with O'Connell's car. It was a breathtaking display of omniscience. During the war, he continued, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Unpleasant but necessary actions were often taken to protect this nation. Alliances were made. Sacrifices were demanded. That is the nature of survival. He fixed his cold, grey eyes on them. "You are good, dedicated men, but you are digging at things you do not understand. Some histories are foundations. They are buried for a reason." He leaned forwards, the pleasantries falling away to reveal the hard steel beneath. "You cannot excavate them without bringing the whole house down. I strongly advise you, for the good of your careers and your well-being, to let the dead remain buried." It was a threat delivered with the weight and power of the entire establishment. In the face of Sir Geoffrey Blackwell, O'Connell and Vance were no longer investigators. They were heretics, standing before the high priest of a powerful and ruthless faith, and they had just been warned of the consequences of their unbelief. The air in O'Connell's apartment was thick with the silence of defeat. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light. On the wall, his chalkboard, once the battlefield for his methodical war against the unknown, was wiped clean. It was a blank slate, a white flag of surrender. "He's untouchable, Elias," O'Connell said, his voice flat and heavy. He handed a glass to Vance. "We're beaten. The game is over." He was a pragmatist, a man who knew how to calculate odds. And the odds, against a man like Sir Geoffrey Blackwell, were impossible. The rational choice, the only choice, was to walk away and survive. "No!" Vance slammed his own glass down on the table, whiskey sloshing over the rim. "That's what he wants. For us to give up. We can't." His eyes burned with a desperate, fervent fire. "The code, Art. The code is our only weapon. It's the one thing he doesn't fully understand. I know it. I can feel it. The full message. It has to be something undeniable. Something that even a man like Blackwell can't bury." O'Connell looked from Vance's impassioned face to the scrap of paper lying on the table between them. The faint, cryptic letters that had started this whole nightmare. For his entire career, he had lived by a simple creed. Trust the evidence. Trust what you can see, what you can prove. But the evidence had led him to a dead end. His science, his logic, his entire worldview had failed him, leading him to this very room. A beaten man facing an unbeatable enemy. All that was left was Vance's faith, an irrational, unprovable belief in the power of a hidden message. To trust Vance now was to abandon everything he had ever stood for. It was a leap into the dark, a surrender to the very kind of thinking he had once scorned. He picked up the piece of paper, the letters seeming to mock him. He looked at Vance, at the unwavering conviction in the man's eyes, and he made his choice. "All right, Elias," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "but let's read your tea leaves." They worked through the night, back in the sanctuary of the university library, fueled by stale coffee and a shared, desperate purpose. The coded message was projected onto the screen, a familiar enemy. But now, O'Connell was looking at it with new eyes. He was no longer just a detective. He was a participant in Vance's strange ritual. "He talked about foundations," O'Connell said, pacing before the screen, replaying the confrontation at the club. "He said you can't excavate them without bringing the whole house down." Vance's head shot up. "Keywords! Art! You're brilliant!" He was threatening us, but he was also giving us his vocabulary. Vance, energized, turned back to his charts. He took the words foundation, house, excavate, bury, and applied them not as a direct cipher key, but as a structural concept. He began to treat the code not as a sentence, but as an architectural blueprint. The outlier letters became cornerstones, the repeating patterns became flaws. And with O'Connell's real-world conversational clues providing the framework, Vance's symbolic structure finally unlocked. The code unraveled. It wasn't a message, it was a ledger, a list of names, and next to each name, a date. "My God," Vance breathed, his face pale in the light of the projector. "It's a kill list." It was all there. The names of the men from Alf's secret intelligence unit. The dates of their accidents, their disappearances. Alf, the Somerton Man, was the last name on the list, undated. He was the last survivor, the keeper of their story. And Tamam Shud, the end of the poem, was his final act. It meant the list was complete. It meant the story was finished, ready to be told, with his own death as the final damning entry. The warehouse district by the port was a labyrinth of rust and shadows, a desolate place where secrets could be exchanged or buried. O'Connell and Vance waited in a dark alleyway, the decoded list clutched in Vance's hand. Their contact was a young, fearless journalist, a man O'Connell knew would print the truth if he could get it. The journalist arrived, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Vance handed him the papers. "It's all there," he said. "The names, the dates." At that moment, the alley was flooded with blinding light. 2 black sedans had sealed both ends, their engines rumbling like angry beasts. Doors opened and dark figures emerged, Blackwell's men, moving with silent, efficient menace. "Run!" O'Connell yelled, shoving the journalist towards a narrow gap between 2 warehouses. What followed was a desperate, chaotic chase through the maze of brick and corrugated iron. Vance, clumsy and out of his element, stumbled and fell, but O'Connell, his police instincts taking over, hauled him up, pulling him through the shadows, using the environment to their advantage. They were a strange, mismatched pair, the academic and the enforcer united in a frantic flight for their lives. As they burst out into an open loading bay, they saw the journalist scrambling over a chain-link fence. O'Connell knew they wouldn't make it. He took the copy of the list from Vance, and with a final, desperate sprint, managed to shove it through the fence and into the journalist's coat pocket, just as he tumbled over the other side. The journalist was gone. The truth was out. A moment later, they were cornered, trapped in the glare of the headlights. The figures closed in. O'Connell and Vance stood back to back, breathing heavily, their hands raised in surrender. They had lost the battle, but with a bit of luck, they might have just won the war. Months later, on a bright Adelaide afternoon, a man bought a newspaper from a street corner stand. The headline was about a minor political scandal involving a city councilman. On page 3, there was a small 2-inch article about the ongoing police budget review. The Somerton Man, the mystery that had once gripped the nation, was gone. Buried. The official narrative had been ruthlessly effective. Detective Sergeant O'Connell, it was said, had become obsessed with a fanciful conspiracy theory. In his zeal, he had overstepped his bounds, harassed a respected war hero, and ultimately resigned from the force in disgrace. Sir Geoffrey Blackwell's power had held. The system had protected itself. In a quiet room in a small anonymous house, an older, more weary Arthur O'Connell sat by a window, watching the world go by. He was no longer a detective. He reached into his pocket and took out his wallet. From a worn leather fold, he carefully removed a tiny yellowed scrap of paper. He smoothed it out on the table before him. Tamam Shud. He hadn't won, not in the court of public record, not in the world of verifiable proof that he had once worshipped. There would be no medals, no triumphant headlines. Blackwell and his secrets were safe. But as he looked at the 2 words on the paper, O'Connell felt a strange sense of peace. He had the truth. It wasn't a truth he could prove to anyone else, but it was a truth he knew in his bones, a truth forged in a crucible of fear and faith. He had lost his career, his certainty, his old self, but he finally, truly understood, and in the silent conviction of his own heart, that was a victory. What an incredible story. On the surface, it is a gripping detective mystery about an impossible case. But the real tension isn't just about finding a killer. It is about the battle between 2 fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. You have Detective O'Connell, the man of science. He trusts what is tangible, measurable, and provable. His entire world is built on a foundation of hard evidence and logical procedure. Then you have Dr. Vance, the man of intuition. He operates in a world of symbols, patterns, and philosophical meaning, things you feel rather than prove. For most of the story, these 2 worldviews are in direct opposition. O'Connell's pragmatism clashes with Vance's belief in hidden meanings, but the genius of the narrative is that it doesn't choose a winner. Instead, it argues for a synthesis. The final, crucial breakthrough only happens when O'Connell's real-world, fact-based clue is used as the key to unlock Vance's symbolic, intuitive structure. In the end, O'Connell loses everything in the world of provable facts: his career, his reputation. but he gains a different kind of truth, one based on personal conviction. He is left knowing what happened, even if he can never prove it to anyone else. It really makes you think. So, I'll leave you with this question. What matters more, a truth that you can prove to the world, or a truth that you know with absolute certainty only for yourself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.